All right, greetings, folks. This is Rob with Dr. Rana from Reasons to Believe. I'm absolutely excited to have him on today. I really appreciate Reasons to Believe for reaching out to me, and they actually sent me a copy of a brand new book that today's interview is based on, and that is Humans 2.0. Something of a pet topic of mine, and of a few other scholars that I know. People like Michael Heiser that have delved into this perspective, but obviously from a Christian context, theological context. Does Christianity have a certain explanatory power to, engage with this particular thing? And this was actually a surprise, both in receiving the book, and also the fact that you mentioned it like maybe a year or two, sort of in brief, like that you're working on this type of book. So I was intrigued as to where you were going to go with this book. And so far, with what I've read, you're hitting. So the first half of the book is scientific. The second half is theological, ethical, and philosophical. But you're pretty much hitting. You're going straight for it from the science context. All the cutting edge things that are going on. And so let me just first introduce our guest. So Fazale Rana, he's the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. He is the author of several groundbreaking books, including Who Was Adam?, Creating Life in the Lab, The Cell's Design, and Dinosaur Blood and the Age of the Earth. He holds a PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University. But last and not least, this particular book I recommend, Origins of Life. Both Fazale Rana and Dr. Hiros, they both contributed to this particular book, which I still believe is, even though it was published, 2004?
Yeah.
This is still cutting edge. There's a dedicated webpage showcasing the updates and the perspectives that the book had back in 2004, how it's still current, and maybe if you want to give a brief synopsis on that before we get into the topic.
Yeah, sure. The book that you're pointing out is essentially our response to this idea that is a cornerstone idea to the evolutionary paradigm, and it's the idea that life emerges on Earth through mechanistic, naturalistic processes. And what we do in the book is show that the explanations, and then there's many different approaches that people have taken to the origin of life question. Those different approaches just simply wind up in dead ends. We just simply don't have an understanding of how life originates through a chemical evolutionary type of process. And so we use this as essentially a springboard to make the case that it's reasonable to think that there was a creator that played a role in the origin of life. And we talk about other features of the origin of life problem that suggest a mind was involved. One of them, to me, that's most intriguing is the fact that we see life appearing very early in Earth's history, far earlier than anyone would have reasonably imagined. And that life that first appears is microbial life, prokaryotic cells, but they seem to be very sophisticated and advanced metabolically speaking. And so that very rapid appearance of life that attains that level of complexity that quickly, to me, is suggestive of some kind of input from outside of the system, particularly in light of the fact that we just don't know how to account for the origin of life through evolutionary means. So we try to avoid a God of the gap argument, in the sense that, we're not saying that there's a creator because we can't explain how life could emerge through chemical evolution, but rather what we're arguing is that in absence of that capacity to explain the origin of life, are there other ways to account for life's origin that involve supernatural agency, and are there features that are consistent in the scientific record with the involvement of an intelligent agent? So that's kind of the book in a nutshell.
Yeah, excellent. Now, a little sort of, I don't know if it can be related, but like a random question that came into my mind. Do you think origin of life research and astrobiology and all that stuff, do you think that may have some connection into the Humans 2.0 discussion?
It Yes, in this sense that when we start talking about the idea of transhumanism, where we're looking to use science and technology to alter our makeup in to such a degree that we would create kind of post-human species. Endemic in that view is this idea that human beings are really an outworking of mechanistic processes, that human beings as we currently exist today are simply a way station on this evolutionary journey, and that eventually we will evolve beyond our identity as human beings into a post-human species, whether we intervene or not through technology. And so the argument is that we might as well intervene with technology and shape human beings to be perfectly adapted or more or better adapted to the future that's coming, as opposed to allowing again the vagaries of an evolutionary history. But what's again endemic in this view of humanity is a materialistic, naturalistic view exclusively. And in the sense, I think that drives the work that's going on in origin of life research and in astrobiology. In other words, it's all part of the same paradigm, if you will, that we're looking at the genesis of life, the structure of life, the history of life, including our origin and our history as human beings, strictly in a materialistic framework. And that very much is part and parcel of transhumanist thinking.
So are you giving credence to Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's movie, and and that little baby orb thing at the end of 2010? And yeah. All right, let's get into the book. Why did you decide to write this book? How did it start? And was it sort of like a team effort with Ken? Did you have an idea, or go for it?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we do at Reasons to Believe is we try to make ourselves available to engage the ideas that are in the pop culture when it comes to science. So there's quite a bit of science in the news, and some of that science in the news is intriguing to people. And so we have a publicist that will offer us up to media outlets to offer insight and commentary on scientific advances. And over the course of about a year, I found myself doing a number of interviews that related to the idea of gene editing or computer-brain interfaces or anti-aging technology. And I found that people were extremely intrigued with the topic. And over time, I began to realize that that what was really happening is that we were developing technologies that were, again, primarily for biomedical use, but had applications that went beyond that, where those applications involved human enhancements. And this idea of transhumanism was beginning to pop up in the course of these interviews that I was doing. And I realized that this is actually something that is happening right in front of our very eyes, that the technology is emerging, and it's emerging very quickly, that emerging technology gives legitimacy to transhumanism. And as I began to dig into this idea from more of an academic standpoint, I realized that this idea has moved from the fringes of the academy into the mainstream, where people that are working in science and technology and philosophy and ethics are treating transhumanism as a serious idea, and are seeing this idea actually shaping in the immediate now our culture, and shaping again the world that we live in. And I realized that transhumanism was really going to be something that was going to be at our doorstep very quickly, and that I realize that as the church, we have given very little thought to transhumanism. There are a few Christian scholars that have engaged this idea, but by and large, it's an idea that has gone unnoticed. And so part of the motivation for writing the book was to just expose people to the idea that this is that transhumanism, again, is something that we're going to have to engage well in the near future, and that this idea is an idea that if we don't engage it well, is going to shape the future of our culture and have an impact on the Christian worldview. Because in a sense, transhumanism to me represents an alternative gospel. Yeah. The idea behind transhumanism is that we have a moral obligation, according to transhumanists, to use science and technology to correct the flaws of our biology, to try to improve our biological makeup. And in doing so, again, take control of our own evolution. But the end goal of doing this is to try to create a utopian future where we mitigate pain and suffering, which is a laudable goal, that we promote human flourishing, 100% support that we strive for a better future for humanity. Again, I'm down with that, but ultimately with transhumanism, the ultimate limitation that they see that impacts human beings biologically is our mortality, that we are all going to be confronted with death, and that people are also concerned about the extinction of our species. And so transhumanism provides the pathway for our salvation as individuals and as a species. And now it begins to take on a religious character where people are looking to science and technology as the mode for our salvation. And this is going to be a very winsome gospel in the near future, because we already turn to science and technology, and rightfully so to solve our problems. So why not turn to science and technology to solve the ultimate problem that we have as human beings? And particularly now that we live in a world that's increasingly becoming secular, where science and technology have a growing prominence. If that's the case, then this is going to be a very appealing and attractive gospel. So to me, it was very important that Christians realized that transhumanism was a real thing that we need to be interested in and be willing to engage, and then also to recognize that this represents a competitor to the gospel, and that we need to be equipped to engage that aspect of transhumanism. And to me, I'm encouraged, because as I worked on the book, I realized that the Christian worldview has a lot to offer when it comes to engaging transhumanism in a way that can help us to make use of some of these technologies in the best possible way. And also, transhumanism is going to create a milieu, ironically, that is going to make the gospel relevant and fresh in a surprising way, I think. And so I'm very hopeful about our capacity as a church to engage transhumanism. But if we're not prepared as the church, then I think the concern is that we're going to be caught unaware, and we may not like what that future turns into if we don't have an opportunity to shape it and to play a role in shaping it.
So do you think that this book can then be, because RTB as a ministry, and I only came across you guys in 2014 when Dr. Huros came to Perth, Australia, and that's the first time I met him. And then when I started to read his books, he just published Navigating Genesis, and then I was, by the way, just quickly, I'm 31. I've been a Christian for 10 years, and so around 2010 was when I started getting to Christianity from atheism. So a few years later, I had a sort of like a similar, I guess you could say, conversion story to, say, Dr. Huros, where I didn't really, I come from a family that's Christian, a European family that's Christian, but they didn't, I guess you could say, indoctrinate or force the religion onto me. They just, let Rob sort of discover it. And I did not really come across many, say, young creationists in my early walk. And then when I started to, uh, engage with the scholars, especially in the peer review field, then I started to notice that, hang on a second, I guess you could say my preconceived sort of conclusions, which again were very amateur at the time, are sort of similar to like what the scholars are actually suggesting. And obviously RTB holds to a particular concordance approach to scripture, but at the same time acknowledging the original context of the scripture. So RTB, from what I see now, is that you have all these books you've published, obviously honing in on specific topics, like Origin of Life is now dedicated for that. Navigating Genesis is like a sort of science, theological concordist approach. Then you wrote Creating Life in the Lab. Again, these are all distinct, particular books. Then together, it makes up this thing you call the RTB model. Yeah. So is Humans 2.0 going to be included into that model? Like, because when I was reading the early chapters of this book, I'm thinking of Genesis 1, God telling humans to subdue the earth, so be like scientists on the earth. Do you think so? And then I'm thinking, oh yeah, and then RTB's model would sort of fit into that. Is that where you're going with this ultimately, maybe in the future?
Yeah, well, that's a really great, insightful question. I'm actually contemplating another book that would be somewhat of a sequel to Humans 2.0.
Oh wow!
Where the working
already meaty.
Yeah, the working title in my mind, and who knows? When you start thinking about book ideas, they don't always come to fruition. But the working title is "Should We Play God?" And it's the idea that, when we think about the human origins account, we think about, like in a book like Who is Adam, the idea that human beings are made in God's image, and that, that there was we think about the historical Adam and Eve, and how do we make sense of those concepts in light of the insights that are coming from anthropology, and how can we make sense of those advances in light of, again, a traditional biblical view. But part of the human origins account is the responsibilities that we were granted as human beings, or the responsibilities that we were given as human beings by God, which is to multiply and fill the earth, to subdue the earth, and to rule over the earth. And part of that, of course, is that we are to care for the planet. So creation care really should be part of our model, but also this idea of what does it mean to be rulers over the planet? What does it mean to be to subdue the earth and bring it under our control? And I think within that is this mandate to do science and to develop technology from that scientific insight, so that we can be effective caretakers of the planet, so that we can promote human flourishing, so that we can bring order to an unwieldy world, so that we can take the order in the Garden of Eden and spread it across the planet. And so part of our rulership, I guess, is that we do have authority over the creation, which means that we have a legitimate, I believe, God-given right to make use of the life on the planet in such a way that we can, again, promote human flourishing and minimize pain and suffering. And so, for example, when the Neolithic Revolution happened and we domesticated plants and animals, this was this is artificial selection. This is a type of genetic engineering, right, that we're doing to create domesticated plants and animals. And this is actually discussed in Scripture, and is not discussed in a way that God condemns it, but rather this is, part of what makes us, part of our mandate as human beings. And so the idea would be that, well, when we start thinking about synthetic biology and genetic engineering and creating genetically modified organisms, all these things that are connected with synthetic biology, that again, I think, falls legitimately within our mandate. And so the idea here is that, it's okay for us to play God because we're image bearers. We just want to do it in a way where we're not trying to take God's place, but we're using that technology to fulfill the mandate that we've been given as Christians. And so in some respects, I see Humans 2.0 in that same arena, though it's highly specific now because we're dealing with biomedical technology that again helps us to fulfill the mandate, which is to promote human flourishing, to love our neighbor as ourself. But we also, want to recognize that that technology can be misused or misapplied in ways that I think would be not necessarily fall underneath the mandate. Because while as human beings we were given given authority over the creation, that dominion over human beings is a dominion that belongs to God Himself. So we don't have dominion over human life. We have dominion over the other life on the planet. So in that sense, you could see Humans 2.0 fitting into the creation model and being, beginning to elaborate the other facet of the creation account of humanity that we haven't really dealt with in Who Was Adam. So in some respects, it complements Who Was Adam. It's a sequel for Who Was Adam. But and on the other hand, it's a very different kind of book, compared to what we typically do at Reasons to Believe. But one of the things that we're interested in at Reasons to Believe is, how do we engage science? What does the science-faith dialogue look like? And I think as we move into the future, the question of origins is always going to be a very important question. But I think there's other science-faith issues that are now emerging that as an organization that we need to also engage, whether they are formally part of our creation model or not. And again, transhumanism is one of them. What about, again, this idea of synthetic biology and emerging biotechnologies? I think, creation care and is also another area that's part of the science-faith dialogue increasingly today. And so I think it makes sense for us as an organization to explore those areas as well, trying to bring to bear our approach and the style that we espouse at Reasons to Believe to those conversations also.
Very interesting. So on the Unbelievable podcast, which you've been a guest on with Justin Briley, just a few weeks ago, he actually had a debate between Micah Redding and Nigel Cameron. I'm not sure if you're familiar.
I'm familiar with it. I haven't had a chance to actually sit down and
Right.
listen to it yet.
So I listened to it, and from what I could gather, and that's the thing, I didn't know there was this thing. I could be butchering the name, but Christian Transhuman Society or something.
Mm-hmm.
One of the debaters is like the head guy on that, and I couldn't help but notice that it was bordering on. I think in Christian theology, it's a type of denomination in Christian theology called dominion theology. Mm-hmm. This notion of we are basically Jesus and God on earth. He may not arrive, so what we do is we try and make earth to be like heaven or like Eden again. We bring a theocratic sort of, like, we bring God's laws back in and all that stuff. But at the same time, in my mind, I couldn't help but realize, but hang a second, when you're talking about creation care and human flourishing, these are good things that lead towards that new creation. That obviously Dr. Ross speaks about how it's a brand new universe, brand new physics. So, in a nutshell, I think you've hinted at this just a moment ago, can transhumanism provide a genuine answer or solution to the philosophical concept known as chaos kampf, the struggle against chaos, meaning entropy, death, thermodynamics, all that process of ultimate doom? Can we ever overcome that? And I don't think we can, even though we may want to put the transhumanist argument into that bracket of like Revelation 21, a brand new universe sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question, and hopefully I'm with my response, I'm properly engaging your question.
Yeah.
But to me, I uh, I learned about the Christian transhumanist movement in writing the book, but I didn't spend a lot of time really delving into Christian transhumanism because, in my view, I felt like it was more important to really engage what I would consider to be the secular expression of transhumanism. I think that's really going to be something that's going to be much more important for us to engage as Christians. But Christian transhumanism, in a sense, is a way that some Christians have chosen to engage transhumanism, where they're appropriating those ideas into Christian theology and looking at, again, this emerging technology as the way in which essentially God is going to accomplish our gift of eternal life and immortality, ushering in the kind of the new heavens and the new earth. And I have a hard time squaring that idea with what I see in Scripture regarding the return of Christ. And yet, on the other hand, I'm sympathetic to elements of Christian transhumanism in this sense, that I think, we have an obligation as Christians to try to do what we can to usher in the kingdom of God. And that means that we want to extend the influence of the kingdom of God as much as we can. And that of course, involves sharing the gospel and seeing people coming to faith in Christ. But I think it also means that we are working to play a role as co-redeemers, if you will, with Christ in redeeming society, redeeming the creation that has been damaged because of our rebellion against God. It doesn't mean that we're going to accomplish the final product through our efforts, but that we have a role, I think, to play in doing what we can to use advances in technology to extend and expand the influence and the impact of the kingdom of God, bringing light into darkness, bringing hope into places where there's despair. And so in that sense, I think these technologies are really part of the toolkit that we can use to fulfill the Christian mandate. But that where I would depart from a Christian transhumanist is, I don't think science and technology is going to be the way in which the eschaton is going to be ushered in. That will be ultimately through the person of Christ in the second coming. And so we never want to lose. Technology then becomes a tool that we can use to live out kingdom values and spread the influence of the kingdom of God. But it's never going to be the mode of salvation. That is it found ultimately in the person of Christ. So that's, so I'm sympathetic to some degree with Christian transhumanism, but again, I would have a serious point of departure. But it is interesting because you also get into this idea: how does transhumanism fit with a post-millennial theology, right?
Yeah.
Right. So fun stuff to think about, I guess.
No, I think that response is great. That's the thing. We are in that already, but not yet situation. We're already seated in the heavenly realm, but at the same time, like you're suggesting, I think you hit the nail on the head on the human. I think the keywords are the human flourishing, and how can the gospel further extend how to further extend the reach of the gospel now in light of this new type of technology. Because who knows, like, if the eschaton is still a way off, let's just say we start to, I'm speaking now with recent movies like Blade Runner.
Yeah.
This notion of replicants, and now we're going to go into the science a little bit, but just quickly, have you seen that movie Blade Runner, the recent one?
Yeah.
Is the replicant thing, which is just fascinating to me, is that sort of also whatever goes on in the scientific context of that? Do you think that's also feasible?
Well, that's an interesting question. And that may be more in the area probably of AI, if I'm remembering the details of the movie correctly.
Okay.
For many people, that's part of the post-human future is AI systems that are so much like us as human beings that we begin to think of them as human beings. And who knows, maybe you could have some kind of, organic, machine technology that even further creates the perception that the AI system that we're looking at, again, is something like us in some capacity, that has sentience of some sort, that we would want to grant some kind of status to in our culture.
Yeah, so that just to I don't know, summarize that replicant thing, which these questions are flowing through my mind when I was watching the movie. So you're talking about how the Christian model can provide a genuine scientific, a flourishing sort of approach to human, to the human worth. On top of that, the gospel, how the gospel can be part of that context. And so so then in that sense, when I'm thinking of movies like, say, the Blade Runner and the replicant context, was basically replicants, right? I think you mentioned this in the book, and that is, you can have human pregnancies and births through an artificial womb. Is that do you write this in the book? I'm forgetting now.
Yeah, I do have a section on the book about artificial womb technology.
That's right. In the introduction, you were talking about that, like in brief appendix. Yeah. So
Go ahead, please go ahead.
No, well, in the movie, you have Joe, the main character, okay, where, for example, the main policeman says, "Oh, you can do the job. In this sense, go and kill this young girl that somehow is connected with the fact that a replicant was able to give birth naturally." And so that caused a huge problem. Like, you can't have replicants are artificially made humans, and humans are humans. You can't have the world join. So she goes and tells him, "You can do this because you don't have a soul." Now, I'm thinking that in the movie, there's a depiction of a particular human that's being birthed through this artificial womb, and then she falls onto the floor, and then the main antagonist of the movie, he sort of is disappointed with the product. But I guess you could say I switched off in that scene, because immediately I'm thinking, down to the atomic level, when we're talking about the gamete sex cells, the sperm and the egg when they fuse, and the fertilization and all that stuff that goes on naturally in a female. But technically, the same thing's happening in that artificial womb, because it's still the same chemistry going on from that context, from that perception. And so then it kind of like hit me like a bolt, where I'm thinking, then when does the quote unquote soul enter into that context? Because if it's the same process, it's just one is a human subject versus the other is the same, like, laboratory conditions of the female womb, but it's artificial. When does the soul fit in? And then the movie ends by showing that Kay, the good guy, who's a replicant, he does have a soul, so to speak, because regardless whether he's born through an artificial womb or whether he's born through a human female, he's still human. It's just that he was just genetically sort of artificially made. Has this sort of question also been, like, when you're thinking about Humans 2.0, where you, so is that something similar you've also asked yourself?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I have given thought to that question over the years, in light of cloning, or the cloning of human beings, because in a sense, when you think about artificial womb technology, the grand vision would be that you'd be able to achieve in vitro fertilization, and then take that embryo and cultivate it, for lack of, allow it to develop in an artificial womb environment, so that the reproductive process is completely divorced from the human organism, right? That it's completely done in a laboratory setting. And the prospects of actually doing that right now are really in the arena of science fiction. I mean, there has been in recent years some significant breakthroughs in artificial womb technology that have yet to make their way into a clinical setting. But the idea there is that those artificial wombs would really be designed to help complete the pregnancy for women who give birth prematurely, because when babies are born prematurely, the outcome is not really very good, simply because these children are in incubators. It's a very unnatural environment for them. Whereas the thought is that if you could have them in an environment that would much more simulated the womb, that the prognosis would be much improved. And so people are exploring artificial womb technology largely to help treat and make premature births, more have a better outcome, and maybe even extend the survivability of the birth even earlier than 22 weeks or whatever is the cutoff currently. But nobody can envisions going much earlier than that at this point in time. We don't have the technology to do that. And on the other end, while we can do in vitro fertilization and get embryos to undergo several rounds of cell division, so you get like a marula stage to go through the process of gastrulation and stuff in vitro, is really not something that can happen successfully, because you'd have to have some kind of environment that would mimic the endometrium, where you have that embryo implant and then start getting the placental formation. And that's just simply not something that people have done work on, in part because there are actually regulations that prohibit the persistence of a embryo created through in vitro fertilization beyond I think 2 weeks or something like that. There's after 2 weeks, you either implant the embryo, you freeze it, or it has to be destroyed according to the regulations. So nobody's really done that work to, beyond the few rounds of cell division. So right now, the idea of artificial wombs is really not something that's going to be something that we have to deal with in a substantial way. But the question of ensoulment is a very real question when it comes to cloning, because if you take a skin cell and you take the nucleus from that skin cell and you implant the nucleus into an egg cell that has had its nucleus removed, now you create this clonal zygote, and it undergoes cell division, and you implant it as into a surrogate. In that clone is birth, does that clone have a soul? Right. This is a question that is a very real question that is relevant to the prospects of doing human cloning. And to me, I guess there are two models for ensoulment, and you may be familiar with this. One of them is called a creationism position, where the idea is that in each individual embryo, there's a point in its development where God is creating a soul in that embryo. And there's some biblical passages, I don't recall them off the top of my head, that support that position. The other view is called traducianism, where the idea is that during the fertilization process, there is a spiritual reproduction that happens that's kind of analogous to the biological reproduction, where there's an intermingling of the mother and the father's spirit to create a new spirit in that individual. And this is a view, I think, tracing back to Augustine. And I'm not sure. I think the biblical support for creationism is a bit stronger than traducianism, but it's a very common view. And so the question is, if you take a creationist view, I think you could argue that a clonal zygote would have a soul, because it's a human being, God would honor that and I think introduce a soul into that individual. Even with traducianism, you could somehow argue that through that fertilization process, the image of God is still present or still being transmitted, because I don't really see the image of God being divisible. Either it's there or it's not there. So I think there are ways that you could, within the context of Christian theology, make an argument that a clone would have a soul. I think there's ways you can make an argument that a replicon would have a soul, right? But I mean, in many respects, I think Scripture is silent, but I don't think that, for for obvious reasons, it's silent on this. But I don't think that. But I do think Christian theology is robust enough to produce models that could make sense of the idea that the outcome of a clonal reproduction would be something that would be a human being would be an image bearer. Right.
Yeah. So I've interacted with, and by the way, we're going to get into some of the science, but because earlier on we were discussing on how it's hard to differentiate between the theology and the science, but I think we're doing a good job fleshing both out. But yeah, I spoke with in person with Old Testament scholars like Michael Heiser. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, and
I am, yeah,
and John Walton and that group, and they from a purely Old Testament theological context, when they look at nefesh, they sort of just assert that the image in that sense doesn't really fall into the category of, say, like free will, intelligence, ability, blah, 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 because these models of where, what is the soul, where does it fit? If the soul is sort of like introduced or created sort of like late in the process of pregnancy, then what's happening is this image is the potential image that is then introduced, and then therefore you are actually unfortunately and ironically giving ammunition to the pro-choice group now in regards to abortion. Whereas Heiser then says, but if you see image as nothing but a status, that God, even back in like the first nanosecond of the fusion of it, I don't know the scientific context in that. Maybe you can explain that, but the very instant of that fertilization that takes place, God immediately sees this biological entity now as special, as in His image now, and so therefore image doesn't fall into the category of all those definitions, but purely this particular species now is like I'm going to have a relationship with. Yeah. And I find that ancient Near Eastern perspective so helpful, because then I can just walk into an abortion debate and be like, look, pro-life, because God has said it.
And I see the strength of that argument, and I'm sympathetic to it. I tend to lean personally towards a resemblance view, but I don't negate, the argument that I've heard people make that the image of God is really reflecting, our responsibility, right? That this would be the representative view, and then you're talking about with the status, the relational view, and to me, I actually think all three are
they're all interconnected.
They're all interconnected. So, I would argue that there's got to be something special about us as human beings that merit our status as being those creatures that uniquely enter into that relationship with the Creator. There's got to be something distinct about us compared to other creatures in terms of our capacity for us to serve as God's representatives and to be given the responsibility of being caretakers of the planet and exercising dominion. So I don't think you can completely disentangle those three perspectives, but I do very much appreciate your point. Another challenge I've heard against the kind of the resemblance view also it would be related to people that are mentally challenged, right? That are, because people may lack certain capacities, does that mean that they then lack the image of God if the image of God reflects our capacity for symbolism and cognitive, advanced cognitive abilities and things like that? So I appreciate the arguments against the view that I hold, but
I wouldn't say, just quickly, I wouldn't say I'm arguing against. I think, like you said a moment ago, I think these are models that there should be overlap in all of that.
So but this actually does have bearing on this question of transhumanism, because there are going to be in the future, I think, technologies that really begin to push the boundaries of what does it mean to be a distinct human individual. I mean, we're kind of, maybe we could move into some of the science. This could be a good springboard, but I mean, one of the technologies that I find really fascinating, and I'm not a brain scientist, so you know, was learning as I was writing in some respects, but one of the areas of advances in biotechnology, bioengineering that I think is really intriguing, that plays into the transhumanist vision, are computer brain interface technologies, where people are developing these computer hardware systems that can essentially detect the electrical activity in the brain and transmit it to to machines. And you can train patients to control the computer hardware and software with their thoughts alone. And and these computer brain interfaces can be non-invasive, where it would be like an EEG cap that they would wear, that would pick up, again, electrical activity through the scalp and through the skull from the brain. That those tend to be systems that struggle with signal to noise ratio. But there's also semi-invasive, where you would lay the interface on the top of the brain, and then fully invasive, where you would implant the interface into particular regions of the brain. But in all three instances, there are studies done with both lab animals as well as with human subjects, showing that humans can, again, learn to with their thoughts to control computer hardware and software. Now, this is really exciting when you think about how this can be used to treat patients that are locked in because of a brain injury or a stroke, or people that are amputees or quadriplegics, where they can control robotic prosthetic limbs and exoskeletons. And of course, there's the prospect of neuroprosthetics, where you could have cochlear implants, maybe artificial retina. So wonderful technologies, right? But what's intriguing is the idea that you can now actually tether people's brains together with computer brain interfaces. So when you start looking at Bluetooth technology and the internet, for example, we could, in principle, both have computer brain interfaces where, again, we could learn to control computer software with our thoughts and begin to transmit our thoughts to one another, even though we're on opposite sides of the world, right?
Right.
And where I could begin to even affect your behavior, your motor activity with my thoughts, and vice versa. And so this sounds really bizarre, but there are actually these classic studies that have been done with rats as well as with monkeys, showing that when you have computer brain interfaces in these animals, they can begin to learn to work cooperatively, by tethering their brains together to solve problems. Where one animal might be trained to solve an aspect of the problem, the other animal trained to solve another aspect of the problem that they're confronted with, and they learn to work in tandem to actually accomplish a larger task. There was a classic study done, I think it was at the University of Washington in the United States, where you had two test subjects in different parts of the campus, basically where one test subject could actually, with his thoughts, cause another test subject to involuntarily move a trigger finger in response to watching or playing a video game. And so you got these bizarre scenarios. So you have people like Elon Musk, who has formed a company called Neuralink, where he's looking to develop kind of a brain net, or Michio Kaku, some speculating that the brain net will replace the internet in the near future. Now that becomes really bizarre, because it means that suddenly I can influence things remotely, and I can actually become delocalized, where my thoughts are now having an influence beyond my immediate physical surroundings, and I could easily you could easily envision scenarios where people begin to lose their identity, right? If you begin to become interface with enough other brains. So
It sounds like now you finally become one flesh.
yeah,
like,
yeah.
like literally in a digital way. Yeah.
And the thing is, I mean, this sounds really bizarre, but when you begin to look at what's been accomplished with computer brain interface technology, we really are stepping stones away from this kind of advance. And so to me, this is where, again, the image of God concept really becomes vital in terms of thinking about, is this something that we should actually pursue? What does this mean now in terms of our identity as a human being? And what does this mean if we actually think that there's an immaterial aspect to our nature when we're beginning to do this, right? And it really creates, I think, interesting problems, I think, for the mind-brain discussion, right?
Yep.
And it really begins to push on certain aspects of Christian apologetics that involve the brain-mind distinction. So, there's fun days ahead of us as Christian apologists and as Christian thinkers in light of these kind of advances. But of course, there's also these ethical questions that really arise that are very serious and pressing questions about, is this technology we really should pursue? And if we do pursue it, how should we limit the scope of the application? Because I've also heard people working in this area arguing that if we could actually tether our brains together, this could actually be of a real benefit for people that suffer from a stroke, that are going through a rehabilitation process where they're trying to recover lost motor function.
Yeah, interesting.
Right?
Wow.
Where if you have a therapist who can begin to think through what needs to be done to begin to activate the movement of a limb, and that's transmitted to a stroke victim, that input into the brain could actually help train the brain to recover that lost function. And so there's, even though it's kind of bizarre, there's actually a very useful, legitimate application of that I think most of us would be comfortable with. But then there's other applications that really begin to, I think, raise some measure of concern, right? So
yeah, there's just so many questions now just popping into my mind on what you just shared. That's just fascinating. So let's stick with the science, but I'm thinking, so earlier on, abortion. Now, so these are the questions that popped into my mind. I was and take your pick. So abortion was mentioned, and I was thinking, because in the book you have, like, in part 1 you have gene editing, prospects of human enhancement, neuroprosthetics, brain-computer interface, which is what you just mentioned, and then anti-aging technology. And somewhere in there you speak about how there can be manipulation of the embryos so that you can have like an Olympian baby or something. So can this science, because remember because we're angling at this from a Christian context as well, like a pro, I guess you could say a Christian version of transhumanism for pro-human flourishing and all that stuff. So things like abortion, can that thorny subject have that Christians can better approach that subject in a much more dynamic and fruitful way with technology like this, so that maybe they don't have to go about doing abortions, because now we can actually aid in the non-killing of that embryo.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a great question, and there's, I guess, a couple of ways that we can kind of approach that, and maybe we'll go with both approaches. But one is kind of returning to the artificial womb technology. In my mind, I see that actually as pro-life technology, in the sense that it's going to, number one, ideally improve the outcome of premature births, which in and of itself is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But what it also now is opening up the possibility that if that technology develops so that you can actually have premature births that are with successful outcomes that in which the birth happens even earlier than 22 weeks, let's say 20 weeks, maybe 18 weeks. Well, now if you're talking about 18 weeks, you're talking about 4 months into the pregnancy, right? 4.5 months into the pregnancy. So you're just about at that point where, you could conceive of, instead of women having abortions and the fetus being destroyed, is that a woman could have not an abortion, but a premature birth, where that child then is placed into an artificial womb. And so that woman could terminate the pregnancy without destroying the fetus, right? With that, again, having an outcome where that embryo is actually carried through technology to full term. And so in that sense, I see that as being one avenue by which, again, you could end, you could reduce the number of abortions, but yet at the same time, women could actually make a quote unquote pro-choice decision, so to speak. Right.
And that's interesting.
So this is where the technology could actually maybe help to resolve, some of the debate. Now, I mean, on the other end,
choice life.
Yeah,
the what a paradox, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, there's going to be a lot of questions, because artificial womb technology is going to be expensive to implement it. So the question is, to what degree can we implement it, in terms of rescuing, embryos that have been aborted? But at least it creates the prospect or the opportunity for something like this to happen, right? Now, and then on the other hand, you're looking at things like, could you do gene editing on human embryos, and by doing that, eliminate, one reason why someone might choose to terminate a pregnancy, and that would be because that child is going to be born with a severe genetic defect, right? I mean, that, for example, with some people will elect to abort their embryo because of that embryo has Down syndrome, or the genetic testing shows that child will be born as a Down's baby. And in fact, in Iceland, apparently, there's such aggressive genetic counseling that goes on with pregnancies that virtually they have only a handful of births a year where the child is born as a Down's baby, and to the point where they have in effect eliminated Down syndrome from the culture, or from Iceland. But the problem here, of course, is that it's through genetic screening and the destruction of either embryos, or the destruction of or the forced abortion. And so in that sense, the technology on the surface is eliminating a genetic disorder, but it actually is doing it, almost in a type of as a form of a high tech eugenics, where you're targeting people with genetic defects. So to me, things like gene editing as a way to correct a genetic disorder is a legitimate technology when you're using it to treat adults, right? Where you're applying the technology as what's called somatic cell gene editing. But when you're doing gene editing at the embryo stage, it essentially is going to involve creating embryos through in vitro fertilization, with the hope that through that in vitro fertilization and gene editing process, which kind of happens simultaneously, that you can actually correct the genetic defect. The problem is that the technology is never foolproof. It doesn't work 100%. There are some technical challenges, and which means that you're going to have embryos that either were not effectively edited, or even though they were edited, there's other genetic errors that were introduced, and those would have to be destroyed. So you could potentially eliminate genetic disorders, but the pathway for doing that is actually a very bloody pathway. Right. So in one respect, who would be opposed to eliminating a genetic disorder from the human gene pool, right? I would be all in favor of that, but the pathway by which you would wind up doing that really involves questionable practices from an ethical standpoint that I think I would have a very difficult time supporting. So it's, none of this stuff is black and white. It's a very messy, ethically ambiguous arena that we're stepping into when this technology is being used even for biomedical purposes, let alone now for enhancement purposes.
Just to put a little tongue-in-cheek comment on that, even though it is a serious, like when you're saying bloody road, oh yeah. But since you mentioned Iron Man a lot in the book,
yeah,
in the first Iron Man movie, which in my opinion, and this is to all the Marvel people out there, all the Marvel movies today are just too fantastic. I think the genuine, more natural, like believable movie that the Marvel Cinematic Universe produced was the first Iron Man.
Mm-hmm.
And in that movie, Jarvis tells Iron Man that, like, when he first makes his suit, the silver suit, Jarvis goes, "Oh, there's going to be terabytes of data that needs to be downloaded in order to make a first flight." And then Iron Man goes, "Jarvis, sometimes we need to run before we can walk. Like, before we are even able to walk, we should still just try and run." And I think that's maybe that may have an insight in this, where it is a long, bloody road, but somehow maybe we could find a way to avoid the bloody road and get to that where we're able to run even before we can walk, sort of thing.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, I don't have a fundamental problem with doing gene editing on human embryos if we could somehow wake up tomorrow and the technology worked impeccably, right? Because but the problem is to get to the point where the technology works reliably enough that it really is serving a higher purpose. You're going to have to do so much experimentation on human embryos, and the technology, as it's going to move into a clinical setting, is going to be imperfect. And so there's just I just don't know of a pathway that we would go through to get there. Now, I mean, there could be the possibility of doing the gene editing at the gamete stage, right? So instead of doing the gene editing, at the embryo stage, could you do the gene editing with the sperm cells or with the egg cells? And that may be a way to kind of work towards eliminating genetic disorders without doing essentially embryo screening and embryo destruction. Where if you have parents that know, let's say one of them has the gene, the mutation for Huntington's disease. I mean, I've known people that who know that they are carriers for the Huntington disease, or that the genotype that says they're a carrier for Huntington's disease, and they just simply choose not to have children because they don't want their children to have that 50-50 risk of having Huntington's disease. But if you do have that gene testing and that's the case, could you actually correct the genetic defect in the egg cell or in the sperm cell, and by doing so now allow that couple to have, through in vitro fertilization, to have children, and in effect you've now broken that cycle, right, where that person that has Huntington's disease is guaranteed of being able to reproduce without having children with Huntington's disease. And you could, systematically apply that, and you could dramatically reduce, maybe even eliminate certain genetic disorders from the human gene pool. So there are creative ways, I guess, to your point, that we could get around some of the ethical issues. And if that's the case, then, hey, I would be, all for, that kind of application of the technology.
And I think you do mention that in the book, don't you? Like, even at the gamete level, there's prospects for that. Now, the brain interface technology. So I'm thinking of a recent 2014 movie, RoboCop, the remake of RoboCop. And I think there's an example where you have both the evil sort of behind the scenes bias and manipulation going on, like ulterior motives sort of thing. Whereas it actually the movie ends in a very positive note. So this cop that, and for those who don't know, basically I think there's an attempted assassination. I forget now, but his car explodes in front of his house. He's so disfigured that the only thing that is able biologically of his body that's able to survive are his lungs, his heart, and his brain. And I guess you could maybe somehow half the spine or something. And then the rest is just this robot, completely hands, legs, everything that that he's able to control like a human. And so then my question then is, do we define, so again, try and maybe see this scientifically, but do we define human exceptionalism and human worth and all that stuff from the theology context? Do we define it as, so when I look at my hand, does this hand define who I am? You see what I mean? Because in RoboCop, all he's left with is his lungs and his brain, and that's it. And the rest is just machine. So, and then I just find it interesting how at the end of the movie, he's then able to reconcile with his wife and his son. And it's interesting, the son obviously is touching him, but it's touching not his dad. Yeah. It's touching the robot. But the dad is still there, like the human face is still there, the brain is still functioning. So yeah, that's another fascinating sort of, there's transhumanism like explicitly stated in the movie, and yet now we're getting into the human exceptionalism ethics. What is human worth in that sense?
And that's a wonderful example of, I think, kind of the concern I would have as a Christian, where you begin to kind of create a human machine cyborg, which is the pathway that we're on. And it's very easy to justify something like that when you know that here's a patient who's lost a limb, who's an amputee, that you want to restore some kind of, mobility or some kind of capability with the robotic prosthetic limb. That almost seems to be obviously a thing you want to do. But at what point, is the machine, human hybrid altered to such a degree that individual loses their identity as a human being, particularly if they have to rely on a computer-brain interface, to control everything about them, right? But what's really interesting to me, though, too, is the work that's being done for people that suffer from stroke or brain injuries who are locked in and can't communicate. And, that even though they're locked in and they can't communicate, they're still there, right? And the technology is now allowing them to express themselves. I don't tell the story in much detail in Humans 2.0, but I have written about this in a blog article, and it's a story of a violinist named Rosemary Johnson. She was with the Welsh National Opera Orchestra in the 1980s and was this young, promising violinist, and was in an automobile accident and was in a coma for a number of months. And when she came out, she lost the capacity for movement and speech. And she's part of a group of patients that are working with neuroscientists to develop a computer-brain interface that allows patients like Rosemary Johnson to compose music using computer software and her thoughts by selecting notes and phrases. And in fact, those patients can actually direct the play of other musicians who, by basically selecting notes and musical phrasing in real time, using that software where the musician sees the same screen as the patient. And so there's some very moving videos of Rosemary Johnson, directing the performance of other musicians. But what you see is that, she's been locked in for 30 years and has suffered seriously significant brain damage, but yet still has an enormous amount of joy that arises out of being able to express herself through music, right? and even
Mm.
has the wherewithal to compose the music, right, and express herself through, through very sophisticated expression of symbolism, though she still can't even though she can't speak, and those parts of the brain that are involved in speech are somehow damaged, and so that she's still there, right, even though there's part of the brain function that's compromised. And so in a sense, she represents an interesting case study, um, similar to, where does that human begin or end when you talk about like a computer, or sorry, like a human cyborg, right? Similar to the RoboCop situation. At what point is that biological material that's left behind, at what point does that lose its identity as a human being, right? So,
Yeah. You see, and then I'm thinking of the gospel in that sense. Will I still preach the gospel to, say, RoboCop, who's just lungs and head?
right.
And I would say yes. I reckon
Yeah.
that, yeah. All right. Now, sort of like a brief overview of the science. So part one, chapter one, gene editing and the prospects of human enhancement. I think you get into this CRISPR-Cas9
Yeah.
to basically the cookies on the lower shelf.
Yeah.
What's going on with that?
Well, I mean, it's a remarkable technology that is based off of a genetic system found in a lot of bacteria that allows the bacteria to essentially develop what's called adaptive immunity to viral infections or exposure to foreign DNA. And by adapting that biochemical system, researchers realized that they could develop this very powerful gene editing tool that would allow them to do very precise manipulations of the genomes of organisms. But the technology is extremely easy to use and is relatively inexpensive. And this is ushering in a revolution in synthetic biology. And people realized that they could apply the same technique to do gene editing on human cells, which now opens up the prospects of gene therapy, where you could deliver, this CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing package to cells and, in a sense, either correct the defects that are found in a defective gene, or you could replace that defective gene with a healthy gene, or just simply insert a copy of the healthy gene into the genome, leaving the defective gene intact. And there's other types of manipulations that can be done with the CRISPR gene editing system as well. But this allows us to essentially, in principle, treat genetic disorders that involve a mutation to a single gene. And there's somewhere between 5,000 to 10,000 genetic disorders that involve a mutation to a single gene. And many of these are rare genetic disorders where there's not treatments whatsoever. Others are fairly common genetic disorders, and we've got therapies, but those therapies are really involving managing the disease and kind of delaying the prognosis of the inevitable outcome. But this technology could provide a way to treat and maybe even cure patients who have these genetic disorders. So, for example, if somebody, let's say, has good grief, sickle cell anemia, right, which involves a mutation to a single hemoglobin subunit, you could envision a scenario where you could take like the hemipoietic stem cells from bone marrow from the patient, and in the laboratory apply the gene editing technique to those stem cells, correcting the defective hemoglobin subunit gene so that it's a healthy version, and then implant those genetically modified stem cells back into the bone marrow, and the patient will now naturally start to produce hemoglobin that is a healthy version of it. Essentially, you would effectively treat that patient with sickle cell anemia. You might even be able to cure the patient of sickle cell anemia, with that kind of procedure. Or let's say you have a patient that has cystic fibrosis, where again, it's a mutation to a single gene that codes for a protein that's a chloride transporter. And that defect causes all the symptoms of cystic fibrosis. Now, here you couldn't do what you were able to do with the blood disorder, but you could deliver that gene editing package as an aerosol to lung cells and correct that genetic defect. Now, and even if you didn't correct all the correct every cells, even if you didn't correct the genetic defect in all the cells in the respiratory system, even if you just corrected a certain percentage, you still would dramatically improve the patient's condition, right? You would dramatically ameliorate the symptoms. Now, one of the drawbacks with, and this is called somatic cell gene editing, because you're not editing embryonic cells, you're editing body cells. Right. Now, one of the drawbacks is that because there's turnover of cells in the lung, you're going to wind up having replacement cells that still have the genetic defect, meaning you're going to have this kind of therapy going on over the course of that patient's lifetime. And that actually raises another problem, because the means by which you deliver the gene editing package can actually elicit an immune response. And so, if that happens, then the patient is no longer going to be capable of being treated once the inflammation becomes severe enough. So you could provide at least some limited therapy, for people with genetic disorders through somatic cell gene editing, but it could be enough that, again, for some genetic disorders, that the outcome for the patient could be improved dramatically enough that it constitutes effective therapy, even though you may not ever truly treat or eliminate that or correct that genetic defect. Now, and this is why everybody is so enamored with doing gene editing at the embryo stage, because if you do the gene editing at the embryo stage, then every cell that results from that embryo is going to have a healthy genotype, right? And therefore you could actually cure the patient of that genetic disorder, where those ongoing treatments would not be required. But of course, that then involves, again, in vitro fertilization and inefficiencies, which are
everything we just
right. So that's kind of the gene editing in a nutshell, and really the two applications that people are pursuing: the embryonic, gene editing, and then the somatic cell gene editing. And of course, there was news a few months ago from China where this rogue physician, did gene editing on 2 embryos, where he disabled a particular receptor protein that binds the HIV virus, and by disabling that particular gene, produced these 2 human embryos that would be in principle resistant to HIV, and then implanted those into the womb of a surrogate that carried them to full term. At least this is the claim. I don't know that there's been proper scientific documentation that they've actually successfully done this, but this is the claim. So you have this example where, again, this kind of gene editing was done at an embryo stage as a kind of a proof of principle that this is the type of thing that we could do in the future, to create designer human beings that, let's say, would be resistant to certain pathogens, or would have genetic defects that are corrected. Or maybe you could even go one step further and say, maybe we could augment the physical strength or the intellectual capabilities of that individual, or the psychological well-being of that individual beyond natural biological limits, through gene editing technology, where you're creating kind of, designer human beings that are, augmented, that are genetically augmented. And so this is a very real prospect, very real possibility. But you could even, apply this kind of human enhancement technology to somatic cells as well. So there, it's the idea of creating designer human beings with gene editing isn't necessarily just limited to human embryos.
just then when you were speaking about this designer baby thing, how now they're potentially immune to the HIV and all that. Believe it or not, that's actually something that was hinted at in that Blade Runner movie, where you have I forgot the name. Basically, the woman that works for the bad company that makes the replicants. She it's like on the tip of my tongue, but she basically is there's a scene in the movie where she has like some form of like business deal with this particular person. Obviously, it's a non-major character in the movie, but basically this person is approaching us saying, look, you guys do this replicant work, and we would like some now this is now someone in the comment just mentioned this is approaching a very fine line ethically. And so I'm thinking of this scene as well, where could you give us some designer babies or designer humans that are not prone to contracting HIV, because this person worked in the prostitution context, and so in that sense, if that's a possibility, then obviously there's that whole dark side of that thing going on. And yeah, now again, you see, this is wonderful for human flourishing, but now notice you can very easily slip into a very dark sort of application of this stuff as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I know you're going to be engaging my friend Ken Samples, on some of the ethical issues, but this is where things become very complex, right? Is that these are not simple questions. With the complexity, the ethical complexity is quite extensive. And excuse me, even when it comes to issues like human enhancements, I'm not just completely sure that all human enhancements are necessarily ethically problematic, but there does seem to be intuitively a line which we shouldn't cross. But it's just really hard to define where that line is. And this is, why I think it's really important for Christians to be able to articulate the Christian worldview well, and to bring to bear the Christian worldview into these kind of conversations in such a way that we work to really shape how the technology is used, so that it is used for the most part for the best possible purposes, and we minimize the misuse of these technologies. Because the Christian worldview does have a very robust ethical system that simultaneously encourages technology development, but at the same time also is willing to put in place protective measures to keep human beings from being exploited. But we've got to be able to engage these advances well in such a way that we help, again, shape the decisions as to what we are going to do and not do with the technology from a Christian worldview perspective.
Now, yesterday you debated Ra.
I did.
And I think you had a taste of what all of us, I debated him about 2 years ago, and I think he had the same reaction he had with you, which is, this is so rare. Usually I'm always engaging with the Ken Hovens, and so that, no, it's good that ministries like yourself, like you actually showcase a robust Christian context, and it really gives them pause to see, like, oh my gosh. So now, naturally, from a human evolution context, if you're doing this sort of gene editing and all that, if going just purely in that evolutionary paradigm, say, I don't know, a ballpark figure, well into the future sometime, are we? Yeah. So let me reword it. Where's your position with respect to Humans 2.0? With respect to, say, your position on, say, Adam and Eve, human evolution,
right.
And I guess you could say people like Ra that go full-blown human evolution, which I am sort of sympathetic to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sort of agnostic on the the RTB version of Adam and Eve, and obviously I see where Ra is coming from. But the point is, this transhumanism now, does it actually affect this thing we call human evolution and evolution in general?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's to me,
Yeah.
my thinking on the relationship between transhumanism and kind of the question of human origins is mostly centered on the notion of human exceptionalism, which to me is a scientific concept that I think aligns with, the image of God concept that we see in Scripture. And so I've heard people argue that transhumanism will be the death knell of human exceptionalism in this sense, that if we are contemplating modifying our biological makeup and trying to correct flaws, it means that we really weren't all that special to begin with, that evolution produced us as intrinsically flawed creatures that need to be corrected. And the fact that we can correct ourselves and alter ourselves to produce post-human species means that we really were never all that significant or exceptional to begin with. That's kind of the line of argumentation. And from my perspective, I think what transhumanism is actually doing is demonstrating in a very powerful way the fact that we are exceptional as human beings. Because I don't know of any other creature that exists today or that has ever existed, including Neanderthals, that could actually contemplate modifying our own biological makeup in such a way that we are anticipating altering our destiny as human beings, taking evolution into our own hands and modifying human beings. We're the only creature that's capable of doing it, and the reason why we're capable of doing it is because we have the capacity for symbolism and open-ended generative capacity, meaning that we represent the world with symbols, and we can manipulate those symbols in a near infinite number of ways to create alternate scenarios and problem solve and develop a scientific understanding of the world, and in turn develop technology from that. And so I think transhumanism, or the prospects of transhumanism, actually make a case for human exceptionalism. It doesn't undermine that. And it's interesting to me because, and this is an argument I heard from Ian Tattersall and Noam Chomsky, and that is that when you look at Neanderthals, excuse me, they were on Earth longer than we've been on Earth, and their technology really was largely static. It doesn't really change from an archaic context. It remains in an archaic context. Our technology, when we first appear as human beings, is again archaic, though I would argue it's significantly more sophisticated than Neanderthals. But that aside, but look what's happened in the span of 100 and 150,000 years. Our technology has gone from a primitive, archaic context to now the capability of actually altering our own biological makeup. And that difference in trajectory suggests that there's something distinct about human beings that separate us from even creatures like Neanderthals. And so, for me, I think, human exceptionalism is buttressed or supported by transhumanism. And one of the things that I find interesting about transhumanism is that there seems to be this moral imperative on their part to do whatever we can to extend our life expectancy, to try to overcome our mortality as individuals, but also to try to preserve human beings as a species, at least in some capacity. And that to me suggests that there's this intuitive sense that somehow we actually are worth preserving uniquely. That this goes beyond, I think, our instinct for survivability or to reproduce ourselves, to have as many progeny as possible. This is actually suggesting that as human beings we have some kind of inherent value and a destiny that is frustrated by our own death, that would be frustrated by the extinction of our species. You don't see transhumanists obsessing about fundamental or about altering the biological makeup of dogs or cats so that these things overcome their mortality, that they somehow are preserved as a species, right?
You mentioned design dogs just briefly about only for a yeah. In your book, you mentioned design dogs, but I think that's just more
yeah
aesthetic sort of
yeah. But But yeah,
Yeah.
The designer dogs were created as a proof of principle for,
Yeah.
again,
Right. Right.
developing a gene editing technique that people look to apply actually to human beings. But anyway,
There's a
but
selfishness that humans have, so to
yeah,
only focus on
yeah,
that's what you're getting at. Right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So to me, I think, regardless of whether or not one uh, accepts or is skeptical of the human evolutionary account of our origins, I think, as Christians, we all would argue that somehow human beings stand apart from other creatures. Exactly, again, what the image of God means is open to legitimate debate. But I personally connect the notion of human exceptionalism to the image of God concept. And again, there may be people that are Christian scholars who would reject that or be uncomfortable with that. That's just my personal conviction. But I do think that transhumanism does at least support the biblical concept of human nature, that we do stand apart from other creatures. Whether or not it supports or undermines the notion of human evolution proper is another question. But at least at minimum, it does, I think, help us to defend aspects of the human origins account. And to me, the aspect that probably is the most important part. I mean, I personally think that theologically, the concept of a historical Adam and Eve is very important. Um, and so I'm willing to and, to do what I can to keep that concept intact. But even
Right.
more important to me is the idea of human exceptionalism, or that we're image bearers, because that's the foundation of Christian ethics. That's the foundation of ultimately the gospel. And so to me, where it really matters when it comes to, again, to the exceptional nature of human beings, I think, transhumanism actually does us a favor.
Yeah. And just a brief note on that. So I believe in Adam and Eve historically, like you and Huros argue, and who was Adam. Um, but I also I'm an odd theistic evolutionist. I believe that human evolution, that humans arose through evolution, but Adam and Eve also were part of that, like literally. And I believe the Genesis story is not allegorical, because theistic evolutionists take that allegorical. But at the same time, I don't believe that they were the first humans.
Mhm.
And I actually interviewed Jeffrey Rose, the anthropologist that Hugh Ross cites in Navigating Genesis, with respect to the Persian Gulf flooding. And we had a long discussion on human
Mm.
migration. And in fact, you speak about it, from Africa to the Arabian Peninsula and all that. And in that sense, I take Adam, the whole first man, in that archetypal representation, just as Jesus is the last man in the archetypal. And then that's in that sense, I'm just like, look, it's like I'm having my cake and eating it too, sort of thing. It's like,
Yeah.
in that sense, everything works out. But I see where you're coming from, and that is which is your discussion with Aaron Ra. There are key questions that the evolutionists still need to solve, and that whole new evolutionary synthesis that in London that happened in 2013, like stuff like that. That those are genuine, progress in that arena. Which then, now I could be butchering the science here, but human chromosome 2. So I'm sort of going to use this as an analogy here with transhumanism. And by the way, this is just something that just popped into my mind
Yeah.
just then. So I didn't think of this before, but that fusion event. So would atheists who would look at this transhumanist sort of science and technology sort of defend? So someone like Aaron, would he defend human evolution through that, and then maybe use the human chromosome 2 as an analogy that, look, from a purely naturalistic context, this fusion event takes place, and so therefore, could something similar like that, but in an artificial means, happen through in the transhumanism context? Now, theistic evolutionists, like those in Biologos, will say God was a quote unquote scientist that transhumanized the chromosome fusion event, so to speak. So, do you think there's like an overlap there? Like, in that sense, what if human evolution is true? Then we can use that analogy as a positive sort of Christian focus.
Mm.
No,
Yeah,
I at the same time butchering the science there. So
no. I
yeah,
don't think you're butchering the science at all. No, I mean, I think what you're suggesting is actually really intriguing. I've actually, I actually am of the opinion that it does look like there was a fusion event when you look at human chromosome 2. I think it's hard to argue against it. One of the points that I would make is that in order for that fusion event to happen, it requires kind of a succession of what I think to be highly unlikely events to take place. And so to me, I think there very well could be a fusion event that took place, but that it had to be something that was divinely orchestrated.
right.
Right. And, and there's, if there's, a few years ago, there was a Old Testament scholar and a physicist who volunteer with Reasons to Believe, who wrote a series of articles where they were exploring a concept called hypernaturalism, where they argue that basically that for the most part, God performs miracles within the laws of nature. And what constitutes the miracles is that you have the just right event happening at the just right time in the just right way. And that constitutes a miracle, but God is not battling against the laws of nature that he created, but he's working within those laws to create. And, I thought that was a very helpful, I think a very helpful way to think about divine action. And so I worked with them and we wrote a white paper about hypernaturalism and the origin of life. And this was getting to some of the things that I was talking about last night when I was engaging Aaron Ra. And I was bringing up the point that, we can go in the lab and we can, identify chemical processes that could in principle contribute to certain facets of the original life process. The problem is that when you try to translate that to the conditions of the early Earth, you wind up in with the chemistry being non-productive on the early Earth, where the key difference is the presence or the absence of an organic chemist that is superintending and orchestrating the process to the point where the intelligent agency is become a vital component in the successful outcome of the experiment. And it's not just me pointing this out. There's original life researchers that are pointing this out as well in the scientific literature. Well, but what if you thought about the original life problem from a hypernatural standpoint, where God is working, within the laws of nature, but functioning like kind of a divine organic chemist, where he's essentially allowing the just right thing to happen at the just right time so that certain chemical processes are affected in such a way that it leads to the emergence of the very first cell. So it's not really theistic evolution, but it's not really kind of God just zapping something into existence. It's kind of a hybrid of those positions. Now, let's apply that same thinking now to the question of human origins. And could it be that maybe a bridge position between a creationist position and a theistic evolutionist position would be a hypernaturalist position, where maybe God is functioning like a divine a genetic engineer, where he is operating within the laws of nature, using the natural processes that are available to genetically alter the genome of some kind of hominin in such a way that the result is an entirely new type of genome that bears resemblance to the original genome. It's derived from it in a sense, but it's again a new type of genome that supports a new type of creature, namely human beings. And so so could chromosome 2 be kind of a clue that maybe God has actually done something in a hypernatural way? So you're not really arguing that God is orchestrating an evolutionary process. God is intervening in a very direct way, but you also could see that God is creating again through natural processes, starting with pre-existing material. that that is then being altered through divine in a direct intervention, not in an evolutionary sense again, but in a creation sense. But it's where there's not laws of nature that are being violated, right?
Right. It sort of is in the caveat of like how we perceive it as evolution, but again, it's this divine agency. And someone in the chat mentions Joshua Moretz. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, and he's with Biologos. But so I have a few of his lectures on my channel where he points out that Hebrew linguists look at the word Yetzer in Genesis 2:7, where it says God, out of the dust God formed man. The word for form there is Yetzer, which is only used elsewhere in like the Psalms. And in fact, he wrote a blog on this when the psalmist speaks about you forming my embryo in the womb. The same word Yetzer is used there to mean that obviously there's a development stage process over time that this embryo is taking place. It's forming over time. And so Joshua Moretz goes, isn't it interesting that it says, if you take that definition for Yetzer and apply it to Genesis 2, that over time the dust is becoming human. And, evolutionists will say we're all stardust ultimately, and then obviously the evolutionary.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, but where this now, I think, connects to transhumanism, this idea of hypernaturalism is, in a sense, what we're doing is we're functioning as genetic engineers, in principle, altering our genetic makeup. And we're using essentially genetic processes that already exist in nature. We're just applying them hypernaturally to affect a particular outcome. And so if we're doing that as image bearers, could this then be essentially kind of a something that resembles in some capacity what God would have done when he created human beings? So there, I think there's some ways to kind of bridge the theistic evolution position and an old earth creationist position in a way that I think treats the science with hopefully integrity, right?
And I'm wanting that, by the way.
What's that?
I'm wanting that. I want you and Biologos to become much closer together. That's my Anyway, last segment, and then we'll do one or two questions from the audience.
Sure.
And now it's anti-aging technology. So based on everything we've discussed, can there be a bridge into this thing? And again, because there's just so much in here. Maybe you take the floor in choosing your favorite part in that discussion.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is, we've made a lot of progress in understanding the biology of aging. I think there's still a lot more of insight that we need to develop. I don't think we yet quite have the definitive theory for aging. But what's intriguing is that increasingly there are biogerontologists who are arguing that we really should think about aging as a disease, not an inevitable outcome of our biology. And they argue that if we can think of aging as a disease, then we could actually intervene and arrest the aging process, or maybe even reverse the aging process. And this is the type of thing that you would expect, to see is fodder for advertisements, on these, pay-per-view channels late at night,
Right.
when you can't sleep and you're watching TV. But the fact of the matter is that there are a number of scientists who are taking that idea seriously and who have proposed ways in which we could arrest and even reverse the aging process.
Yep.
And so I talk about two scientists, Michael Fazale is one and Aubrey de Grey is another, who have really pioneered this idea. And when you first hear what they're suggesting, the first reaction, at least this was mine, was, okay, this is bordering on pseudoscience. And then when you actually read carefully what they are advocating, it's like there's they've done their homework, and what they're proposing is actually not ludicrous, but is actually something that looks like it could very well be achievable, at least in principle. And in fact, I just saw an article, I'm going to probably write a blog about it in the near future, where people reversed the biological age of individuals in a small preclinical study, by about 2.5 years by administering growth hormone. that actually it changes the functioning of the thymus, which is a tissue, like a tissue that's part of the immune system that helps develop certain white blood cells. And the growth hormone essentially kind of rejuvenated the thymus and reversed the biological age of the individuals by 2.5 years. And there's a particular epigenetic marker that people will look at that measures biological age as opposed to chronological age. And they saw that marker was reversed by 2.5 years, and they were actually absolutely shocked by that result. But what this is indicating is that we very well could have anti-aging therapies available to us in the near future. And this is going to raise, some very interesting questions because, I'm 56 years old. And if somebody told me, hey, you could go through some kind of growth hormone regime and reverse your age by 10 years so that you, even though you're 55, 56, you could actually be 45, I would actually take it,
Right.
And so in other words, there's a very real temptation, to embrace anti-aging technology. And if anything is going to make transhumanists of us all, it's going to be the prospect of reversing the aging process. And the net effect is that you suddenly would have people that could be living for ages that could approach what we see in the biblical text in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, right? And so
you and I had that brief Facebook discussion.
Yeah. I don't think I did it justice, by the way.
No.
But
I would I'd love to again.
Well, actually, that's as a sidebar, one of my frustrations is I just wish I had more time to actually properly engage, particularly people like you that are raising worthwhile points.
Yeah.
But the point is that we really are looking at in the near future being able to extend potentially human life expectancy through medical intervention on the order of maybe tens of years, maybe even more than that, so that a life expectancy for a human being approaching a couple hundred years may not be out of the question. And again, this is where you start winding up in this gray zone between, is this actually a biomedical treatment of a disease, or is this actually a human enhancement? And when does extending our life expectancy move from, again, improving the quality and the duration of our lives to actually altering our fundamental biological nature, where we're living to life expectancies that are well beyond what would be considered to be normal or natural with respect to our biological limits. And of course, that leads to all kinds of very interesting ethical questions and questions about, should we do this? Should we extend life expectancy? And if we do, what effect does it have on economies, on the family structure, on social structures? But again, this is part of that transhumanist vision, because if we could delay the aging process and extend our life expectancy, we are attaining, we're beginning to approach attaining some kind of practical immortality, right? Or we're moving in that direction of attaining practical immortality.
Pseudo tree of life sort of thing, like we're trying to create our own life. Yeah. And just quickly, someone in the chat, I think this is a brilliant statement. Someone just said, "You're putting a Band-Aid on a dead man."
Oh yeah, with anti-aging technology. Yeah.
That's pretty much. Yeah.
But and I agree with that. But as we all get older, and you start thinking about, okay, how many years do I have left? And am I, what is it that I want to accomplish? Or you just are beginning to feel the wear and tear of the aging process. You begin to be very tempted to put that Band-Aid on. Even if it is putting a Band-Aid on a dead man, you're still putting a Band-Aid on that's doing something in the short term, right? And so great point, brilliant point. But the anti-aging temptation, I think, is very, very hard to resist, even for the best of us, right?
Just quickly, why do we age? I think that's a child's question for any children listening.
Yeah,
Like,
well, yeah. Why do we age? Well, are you meaning, in terms of mechanistically, or, I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, people argue that the aging process is built in to our makeup simply because by having a finite lifespan, it actually promotes the survivability of our species.
okay.
That's kind of that's that's the argument.
But is it just telomere sort of? Is that what it is? Or
Well,
is there more to it?
that's one theory of aging. I mean, there's there's a number of theories of aging that actually may be interrelated to each other. One is the telomere theory of aging, where this is called the Hayflick limit, where it was discovered that cells can undergo X number of rounds of cell division, and then after that prescribed number of cell divisions, the telomere length becomes so short that chromosomal stability is compromised and the cell essentially will die. And so certain cells in our body attain the Hayflick limit sooner than other cells in our body. And so the thought is that this is connected to, again, telomere length, which becomes shorter every time cell division takes place. And so the thought is that if you could add telomerase, you could actually restore the length of the telomeres, and in doing so, reverse, again, the aging process. Other people argue, like Aubrey de Grey, that it's actually reactive oxygen species production that contributes to the aging process. And then there's other mechanisms as well that people have identified. That, and again, it's not quite clear if those processes that correlate with aging are merely consequences of aging, or if they're actually contributors to the aging process. And it's not clear if these are independent mechanisms that are contributing to aging, or if they're intertwined. But the point is that we understand enough, as Aubrey de Grey says, that we can treat aging and the remedy of aging as an engineering problem more so than going in and trying to alter our fundamental biology. If we just go in there and apply certain kind of medical interventions, we can correct the damage caused by the aging process, and in doing so, extend life expectancy. So,
right. And I think, again, Christian application on this would, again, if it comes back to that human flourishing,
right?
And if it means we can extend the human life, so that, for example, I mean, this may sound a little bit depressing or dark, but in the last few months, and in fact just the last decade or so, I've been young and walking in the Christian faith, I'm literally standing on the shoulder of giants. And I've the scholars I've read of, say, the 20th century context are now like passing away. Like Norman Geisler recently passed away, and and I'm just thinking, my goodness, what if they just had maybe one more year to live?
Yeah.
Maybe some other apologetic thing that they may have produced in that time frame, sort of thing. But let's not end it on that note. Let's end it on a more positive note, and that is let's answer a few questions from the audience. And by the way, Fuzz, this has been excellent.
Thank you.
So now I don't know if this is related, but maybe just say yes or no if it's related. But Lucas asks, do you suspect that von Neumann probes would be possible, such as in the We Are Legion or We Are Bobbyverse series?
I don't know what that even means. Oh, I'm sorry. If somebody wants to explain it to me, I'm willing to try to take on the question. But
okay. Let's see. What's another one? There's a lot of the questions are the whole RTB model, ancient Aries, that sort of thing, and they're asking me questions like, why do I believe in evolution? This is an interview for Fazale Rana, not to me. But let's see. If there's anyone who has questions, you can put it in right now, and I'll ask specific on the topic. Kylo, so Kenny Rhodes, he's in the chat, by the way. He's
I know Kenny.
Yeah. Let's see here. Maybe you can touch on this briefly while I look for the next question. Question for Faz. So this is sort of not related, but you could maybe relate it to the Humans 2.0. This is not really a concern for myself, but how do you respond to atheists that demand Christianity or the reasons to believe model to provide reproducible predictive data? So maybe somehow touch.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a sense, I would say that that's really an unfair demand on the RTB model, because our model is primarily an origins model. And so when you're talking about an origins model, you really are looking at, in a sense, natural history. And so when we investigate the history of the universe, the history of the earth, the history of life on earth, this is not something that is reproducible in that sense, but rather is something where we're trying to construct scenarios that we think describes what that historical sequence of events looked like. And so we're essentially engaged in a historical characterization as opposed to the type of characterization that we would do in science, where we're trying to understand, let's say, the mechanism of an organic reaction, where there we are looking to try to create reproducible results. And so the type of scientific approach that we're taking isn't really involving quote unquote reproducibility, but rather, again, trying to construct scenarios. So, we're doing the same thing with our origins model, where we're trying to make a case that when we look at the natural history of the earth or life on earth, we see evidence where it looks as if intelligent agency has intervened. But I would argue that while you may not have quote unquote reproducibility, you can create what I would call a convergence of evidence that supports a particular scenario. So you can study a particular event in life's history through a number of different methods, which hopefully those different methods are giving you consistent, coherent results that give you greater and greater confidence that a particular event took place in a particular way. And you can also falsify a scenario by saying we are making observations that seem to be incompatible with that particular scenario. So I don't think, because a question is a historical question scientifically, that it's not that you can't again generate scenarios that are in principle falsifiable or could be confirmed with additional studies. But you're just not going to ever be able to do what you would, I think of as being genuinely reproducible work, because the nature of the question is really very different.
Now, so I've just got some interesting questions. So, by the way, that von Neumann thing. So he just clarified. Fuzz has already touched on the subject early on with the brain-computer interaction. So somehow that's maybe you, without realizing it, you touched on someone's work or something. Another question is, what is Rana's view on process structuralism? Is that connected to the Human 2.0? Something called process structuralism.
Is that related to like the ideas of Richard Owen? Is that
maybe? Let me just see here. Process structuralism is a school of biological thought that objects to an exclusively Darwinian or adaptionist explanation of natural selection, such as is described in 20th century modern synthesis. It proposes instead that evolution is guided differently, basically by more or less physical forces which shape the development of an animal's body, and sometimes implies that these forces supersede selection altogether.
That's actually a very interesting question. I'm currently working on a book raising the question, is there a biochemical anthropic principle? And what what I'm arguing in the book is that the nature of biochemical systems is fundamentally specified and constrained by the laws of nature. In other words, that what we're looking at when we look at biochemistry is not the outworkings of a historically contingent evolutionary process, but it is the inevitable outcome that is resulting from essentially the constraints of the laws of nature. So, for example, if you're going to have life, that life has to be built around molecules that are proteins, and those proteins have to have the 20 amino acids that we see in proteins in living systems, the canonical set, because of the demands of the laws of nature. And so it's essentially a biochemical version of what I think would be called process structuralism. But I have seen, I've not read extensively, I have seen some people argue that, for example, the process of gastrulation in embryological development is actually dictated by physical constraints, not by, again, historically contingent evolutionary processes. And I find that idea actually very intriguing. Now, and it's what it is essentially pushing me in a direction that would be kind of a version of theistic evolution, but it would be one where, in a sense, what you have is the entire system rigged at the very beginning, so that the only way that things develop is essentially to a specified outcome that was specified at the very beginning. And this is different, I think, than thinking about God guiding the evolutionary process, where God is, maybe not zapping species into existence, but zapping mutations into existence to guide, or that our God is just letting evolution run its course and then is intervening to make use of whatever evolution produces. This is rather saying, at the very beginning of the universe, God puts in place these laws of nature that basically are saying that life is going to be inevitable, not only because of the fine-tuning of the physical constants of the universe, but that fine-tuning is done in such a way that amino acids are an inevitability, and that the 20 amino acids that are the canonical set are going to be the ones that emerge as a preordained set of amino acids that are going to build proteins that are these preordained molecules that have the just right set of properties that make life possible. And so where you begin to see fitness for purpose is that the laws of nature are dictating and constraining only certain outcomes, and those outcomes are exactly what you need for life to be possible. So it's kind of like a fitness for purpose. But I'm actually very sympathetic to that. I didn't realize that there was a term, progressive structuralism or whatever. But so I learned something. But essentially, I'm sympathetic to that idea, and I think that idea may be also something that is shared by Simon Conway Morris.
Okay. This is a very interesting question. When Paul says, "I would rather leave this world than to stay as to be absent from the bodies to be present with the Lord," why postpone what we eagerly desire? So, to summarize, in Philippians 1, Paul says, "It's for your benefit that I stay here, but I desire to leave this world." And then later in Corinthians, he's like, "To be absent from the body, present with God." And I think that's related with the brief observation I made just a moment ago. So this is the anti-aging thing.
Yeah.
Should Christians take on stock positively that we should live, we should try to live as long as we can, sort of thing.
Yeah, because when you look at what Paul is saying in those two passages of Scripture, I mean, it's clear that he desires to be with the Lord, but recognizes that the longer that he persists on earth, that it's for the sake of the gospel. And so, to your example, I mean, wouldn't it be great if Norm Geisler could have lived another 25 years, and not only lived another 25 years, but those would be high quality years where he was operating at the top of his game. as a Christian apologist. And so, for him, to die is gain for him, but it's a loss for all of us. And so I could easily see how somebody as a Christian could justify taking advantage of anti-aging technology, because they feel as if they still have something that they can contribute to the church, and
I hope the crows are not annoying you, by the way.
yeah, I was just like, what was that noise? But then I forgot that you told me about the crows. Yeah. Hey,
That's just
it adds to the charm of the program, right?
All right. And this is an interesting one. How many years would you want to live if you could maintain or improve your quality of life? So, say Norman Geyser lived another 25 years. Now, at the end of those 25 years, suddenly he'd be like, "Oh, I want another 25 years," and do you think it can go on and on like that, infinitum?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the temptation, isn't it? Yeah. So that's the temptation. And something that I've observed. And I want to be careful about generalizing this, but something that I've observed with people that are Christians who are coming to the end of their life is that they actually are not, they're not saddened by the fact that their life is coming to an end, right? Is that many times I think through God's grace that as, our time draws to a close, we are comfortable, we're ready to let go, we're ready to move on, and so, I think that God is administering grace through the process by which we age. And yet, I also, personally want to have the best quality of life I can have while I'm here. And I want it to be around as long as I possibly can, as well. Right. I don't feel as if yet I'm ready to go. But there could be a time in 10 years or 15 years where I feel like, okay, I've outlived my usefulness, right? And it's time to go. So.
And yeah, Jordan Peterson, the psychologist, I was listening to a recent interview he gave where he just broke down, and I think it's so true. He said you have to treat it in such a way that, especially those folks that I say young in age, like myself, when the time comes to be at your father's funeral, to be the strongest. So basically, your walk in life should be such that it's like as if you're the strongest man at your own father's funeral. Like basically, you don't give in to the weakness of the fact that he's passed, and then obviously there's a little hint of that Christian gospel in there. That look, like Thessalonians, don't cry, don't weep. There's obviously the hope in the resurrection and all that. Yeah. I don't think anyone else has any other questions in the chat. Doesn't look like it. So, any final thoughts? I think there was one very brief question that I may have overlooked that says, "What would human 3.0 look like?" In other words, what would be in that research book? If and I think you're sort of getting into that book. Should we play God or something? And yeah. Any final thoughts to wrap it all up?
Yeah. Well, to me, I think whether we like it or not, technology is progressing, and it's progressing very rapidly. And the technology that is emerging can be used for enormous amount of good, and it could also be misused and misapplied. And I think what we want to do as Christians is, number one, make sure we do what we can to understand the technology, and try to be the best voice that we can possibly be to articulate a Christian worldview in such a way that we are viewed as people that promote technology, but also recognize the inherent misuses of technology, and are willing to participate in our culture in such a way that we help shape the outcome of these technological applications in a way that really genuinely promotes human flourishing and is sensitive to the gospel. That we shouldn't view, I think, transhumanists as people that are enemies of the Christian faith, or as a threat, but really people that I think are have a genuine desire to try to see the world a better place, and are just simply um, um, putting maybe undue confidence and hope in what technology can ultimately deliver, and recognize that we do have an opportunity to build a bridge with transhumanism and Christianity, because ultimately we desire the same thing. It's just that the source of how we want to accomplish, or the means by which we want to accomplish the same goal, is very different. Where as Christians, we're looking to Christ, the person of Christ. Transhumanists are looking to technology. But we do have, again, those bridge points that I think can make the gospel relevant in an exciting way, as we move into a future that is going to be influenced by transhumanist thought.
Excellent. So to sort of paraphrase what you just said, so you can see if I've understood this correctly, there's a subtle irony in this emergence of this new technology and science, where humans are indeed tilling the earth, subduing the earth, ruling the earth, and so on, like you see in Genesis. They don't realize that they're doing that mandate. Therefore, as Christians, we should positively engage with fully into the science, without any form of like bias, like the whole young earth creationist. Let's go fully into the sciences, embrace it, and show, look, there's such a beautiful connection between the Christian gospel, the faith, that the whole, the big picture, the big biblical story, that then can be applied specifically for human flourishing and human value and worth. And that's, in a nutshell, what I think your book is trying to get at, is that you're establishing the science, and my goodness, let's use it for God's glory rather than human depravity.
Right.
Yeah. Sweet. All right. I'm just seeing any last questions quickly. I think that all of the questions so far now, so people are putting questions still, but they're just repeating what we discussed anyway. So that being said, thanks so much, Faz. So anyone who may not know, where can we reach you, and reasons to believe, and like maybe summarize that context, and then we'll end the...
Sure. Yeah. Well, if people are interested, they can always visit our website at reasons.org and get access to a lot of articles and podcasts and what have you, videos that represent kind of our perspective on science faith questions. Also, I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and willing to engage people to the best of my ability, and as time permits. That's another way that people can access me. I'm on Facebook again and Twitter, so I'm happy to continue the conversation there if it's possible.
Sweet. Thanks so much, Faz. I'm going to end the live stream, and then we can say bye.
Yep.
Back. All right.